Well, can I start by acknowledging the Gumatj people of the Yolngu Nation and pay respect to elders past and present. The Yolngu have perhaps made an outsized contribution to the discussions about constitutional recognition, giving us two important words, both Makarrata and Dilak. And so I particularly honour the contribution that they have made. It's wonderful to be here in the presence of His Excellency General Hurley and Her Excellency Mrs Hurley. Many other distinguished guests here, including Galroy Yunupingu and other Indigenous leaders, Denise Bowden, and three very important parliamentary colleagues. Ken Wyatt, the first Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Australians, who laid such important groundwork in this issue of constitutional recognition down when he chaired a Joint Select Committee on this issue a few years ago. Ken has brought to that work, as he has bring to the portfolio, a great capacity both to listen attentively and to deliver. And it's an honour to serve alongside Ken and to walk in his footsteps in this regard. I also want to acknowledge my friend and co-chair of the Joint Select Committee that reported at the end of last year, Senator Pat Dodson, and the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney. I came to this debate as a lawyer from Sydney who was interested in constitutional law but didn't have a background in Indigenous affairs or Indigenous policy. And I wanted to record my great thanks to Linda and Pat and Malandiri McCarthy and the other members of the committee who are much more deeply steeped in Indigenous policy for their generosity in answering my questions and in the education that I received from them about Indigenous culture and Indigenous people. My own journey on this issue starts from the time before I was a parliamentarian. I come from that school of thought that regards our Constitution as a remarkably successful document. Australia is one of the 6 oldest continuous democracies in the world. We like to think of ourselves very often as a young country, but both in terms of our Indigenous culture and in terms of our constitutional history, we are actually a very old country. And because of the success of our democracy, we should be quite cautious in changes that we make to the Constitution. My record on constitutional issues is that more often than not, I will have found myself on the no side of referenda. In 1998, I was an elected delegate to the Constitutional Convention to deal with the issue of whether Australia should become a republic. I then served on the 10-member No Committee for the 1999 referendum. I edited a book on the case against Australia having a Bill of Rights, and I led a Citizens Committee opposing changes to recognition of local government in our Constitution. But I saw the issue of Indigenous constitutional recognition as wholly different. I saw this as an issue that was worthwhile engaging in to try and help shape and support outcomes that worked with the grain of the Constitution rather than against the grain of the Constitution. And so before I became a parliamentarian, with other constitutional conservatives, I set up an organisation called Uphold and Recognise, which continues to exist today, although I'm no longer a director, and continues to publish papers. Many people will have seen the recent contribution made by the former Chief Justice of Australia, Murray Gleeson, as part of the work that Uphold and Recognise did in association with the Gilbert and Tobin law firm and the PM Glyn Institute at Australian Catholic University. The issue of constitutional recognition has been around a long time. Many people trace it back to that great Yorta Yorta man William Cooper and his petition of King George in the 1930s. We know the Uluru people themselves used bark petitions. We think of the Barunga petition, and we think of, at other times, discussions that have occurred at the political level in the 1980s and 1990s. Previous ideas about constitutional recognition had words, symbolic and historical words, being placed in the preamble to the Constitution, or more latterly ideas about racial non-discrimination clauses, or a clause that was to suggest that the racist power under which laws about Indigenous people are made by the Commonwealth should only be used for the benefit of Indigenous people. Those ideas that had come before were largely rejected by the Statement from the Heart at Uluru. The Statement from the Heart is a watershed moment in the discussion about constitutional change in this country in relation to Indigenous people. it's a watershed moment because for the first time when Indigenous people were actually deeply consulted, they said, we don't want something symbolic, we don't want to give the courts a veto, we just want to be consulted on the laws and policies that affect us. And I thought that that was a very, very important and very good development, because if we're going to engage in this process, it should be something that Indigenous people want, and it should be something that is going to improve and change the lives and outcomes for Indigenous people across our country. While Uluru provided a direction, it did not provide much meat on the bone, as it were, as to what the voice meant. Yes, there were some models around at the time, and indeed before I was a parliamentarian I'd been involved in the early stage development of some of those models. But it didn't provide that necessary meat on the bone, and that was the task which the Joint Select Committee last year that Pat and I chaired was tasked with doing. The Joint Select Committee received over 500 submissions from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. We held 24 days of hearings in every mainland state capital, in the Kimberley, at Barunga, in Dubbo, in Wodonga and Shepparton, in Thursday Island, Palm Island and Townsville. The final report of the Joint Select Committee considered 21 different models of past, present and proposed methods for consulting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It also elicited 18 different models for constitutional change. The committee divined that there were 9 principles that we could see from the consultations that were particularly consistent as we went around the country and heard from people. Those principles included that the support for voices at the local and regional level was very, very strong. That is a local voice or a regional voice. That members of the voice should be chosen by Aboriginal people and not appointed by government. That the design of the voices should reflect differences in local communities, not a Canberra knows best, one size fits all model. That there should be equal gender representation. That because not all of the challenges that Indigenous people face are challenges created by the federal government, that the voice should be used by state and local governments as well. That it should provide advice and oversight and plans but not necessarily administer programs or money. That it should provide a forum for people to bring ideas or problems to government and a forum for government to evaluate policy. This should be a dialogue between government and Indigenous people. That we needed to consider many existing bodies in some instances that would perhaps form the basis of the voice, and in other instances would continue to operate alongside the voices. That cross-border communities in places like Albury-Wodonga should be considered as perhaps one community, and that advice should be given at the earliest available opportunity in the development of policy rather than at the end of the process, as for instance the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights does, where effectively the horse has already bolted. What we decided is, although we had been able to divine those principles, that the differences in community around the country meant that we were not able to, at the end of our 9 months looking at this issue, to say this is what the body should look like. Instead, we made a series of recommendations around the importance of the next step. And the next step that we recommended that needed to be taken was a process of co-design between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and government to ensure that models that came forward for voice, particularly at the local and regional level, reflected the desires and outcomes that Indigenous people on the ground sought to see. The sort of questions that would need to be asked are, what problems is the voice seeking to solve? How will it work? Who will serve? What will be its powers? We made 4 recommendations, and the first one was in relation to co-design, and what we said was when the process of co-design was finished, then we could look at what legal form the voice or voices should take. We also made some recommendations in relation to truth-telling and in relation to a national resting place. I think these recommendations were highly significant, and I think what is highly significant about the recommendations is we tried to work very hard as a committee to focus on the things that we could agree on as a committee, where we could build consensus, and we hope to produce a report that would be acceptable to both sides of the House. And I'm very pleased to say that we are in a very good place, and we should celebrate the fact that we're in a good place. All of the recommendations of the committee report were accepted by both government and opposition. We have commitment to constitutional recognition at the level of both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and we have a commitment to the voice as well, and we should celebrate those facts. Now the next step is the co-design process, and I think it's important that we let that process run, that we see what comes out of it, and then we proceed to the discussion about what legal form it should take. Thanks very much.
Let me acknowledge the Gumatj people on whose lands we've gathered to have this discussion, and I acknowledge all their leaders and their leadership over many, many years and their great contribution to many things of concern to First Nations peoples, and they're still making that contribution, and I thank them for that. I want to also acknowledge the Governor-General and his wife, the Minister, Ken White, and his wife, the Northern Territory politicians that are here, my colleague Linda Burney, and the two treaty commissioners from the Northern Territory, Mick Dodson and Ursula Raymond, because they're an important conjunct to this Northern Territory process of treaty making. There are many other dignitaries here, and I acknowledge you all. I just want to recall that the Uluru statement came out in 2017. Prior to that, of course, there'd been an expert panel that had made recommendations to the Parliament back in 2012, and that there'd been a previous Joint Select Committee, which Ken and Nova Peris co-chaired and made recommendations. So this whole journey towards recognition in the Constitution has been going on for some time. The government's been in power for over 6 years, and that shouldn't be lost on us. And I say that because it's a matter of fact. The questions that are before us now are clearly, where is this matter of constitutional recognition? It's in the Parliament, thanks to the good work, I think, of the committee that Julie and I participated in, but also thanks to the public and to many of you out here who've kept before the Australian Parliament the need for recognition of the First Nations and to get that work done. And I want to express my appreciation for all of those who've been in that arena. Clarity is something that obviously as a parliamentarian you want to be able to deal with in a piece of law so that everyone knows what it is that you're legislating into existence. But in broad terms, in very broad terms, this matter of constitutional recognition is in the hands of the government. It's in their hands. I'm in the opposition. And when I say that, it's also in the hands of the public, people like yourselves, to keep the pressure on. The Uluru Statement is also in the hands of time, of organisation, dedication and purpose. And by that I mean we're almost back to the start of a process here. Almost back to the start of a process. I agree entirely with what Julian said about the goodwill and the usefulness and the effectiveness of the contributions made to our committee. But in terms of political process, we're almost back to the start of the beginning of this, having been obviously the opportunity to be informed by some very good contributions. So the design process is a concept that itself has yet to find some clarity. What is the design process? Who's the participants in it? How long is it going to be conducted for? And what are the expectations that we hope to deal with? Now, the co-design process straddles a number of things, a number of processes that we, if you don't follow this very carefully, can be misled upon. One is the co-design process to develop the elements or the model for the voice to the Parliament. What will that look like? What will it be? Its powers, function, structure, etc. So the co-design around a piece of legislation that would be enacted by the Parliament of Australia, having gone through the process of consent, argument and discourse with the First Nations people and arrived at some point. That's the first part of this. The second part of it is the co-design around referenda. Now, referenda gets thrown around as if it's pretty easy to achieve, but it's not. And I don't make any doubts about that. But referenda is in what? About recognition. We had the confusion between representation and recognition in the Constitution. So you've got to be able to distinguish what politicians are talking about when they talk about recognition and when they talk about the entrenchment in the Constitution or representation, having a voice that is legislated not in the Constitution but with representatives speaking to the Parliament in one shape or another. These are matters that the Minister has been grappling with, I know, and he will grapple with this for some time yet, but we don't have a lot of time. Parliaments only sit for three years, and it's imperative that we work together, and that's important why Julian and I try to collaborate as much as we can, and our parties are trying to collaborate as much as we can, because this is just not the burden of the Minister. He has to lead his party to a point where they can sign off on matters that some of them don't feel comfortable about going to. And one of those is treaty, is to put it squarely on the table. Because remember, there are three things that were asked for from Uluru: a voice, enshrinement, and a treaty process, or makarata. And of late, that matter has been falling and drifting off the table. Now, I want to come back to that in a minute. So, the co-design process really has to get on and get into existence to deal with the legislation, to cover the complexity of regional representation, local representation, national representation, and the integration of those factors to the Parliament. It also has to deal with the reality of existing peak organisations and other incorporated entities, and how do they relate and correlate to the Parliament across the nation. Because we're talking about, this is a request to the Parliament, it's not just to the government. So how do you relate to the Parliament of Australia and not just to the government or the minister in a government? So there are some challenges here, and I've got no doubts about that. But it's hard work that has to be done and needs to be done very quickly. You've got 4 months left of this month, of this year. It feels like 4 months left in this month, but it's 4 months left in this year. Time slips away, let me tell you. Julian and I sat on that committee from the 3rd of 2018 through to the 11th of 2018, and we came up with that report. Now, if we're going to have another consultation process, it's going to take a bit of time. And my fear is that we may run out of time, particularly to deal with the three things that people have asked for: a voice of the Parliament, entrenchment in the Constitution, and a treaty process. And there has been suggestions, as Julian has mentioned, for the set of words that you could use to go to referendum on to embed the voice into the Constitution. From the very simple set of words like "there shall be a voice to the Parliament," it shall be advisory, its form and structure shall be legislated by the Parliament, and that's about all you need. So you can have a hook that lines you up to amplify the power that the Parliament already has to do this anyway. But anyway, it's a matter that could be done relatively quickly with goodwill across the political divide. We could also set up the Makarrata Commission. There's no reason why the government can't do two things at once. You know, surely. It could set up the Makarrata Commission. And I know that's a complicated process. It's a long process. You have to help people who are going to get treaty ready. People who are going to understand what they're going into to negotiate about. They've got to put down, you know, the log of claim. All of that has to be worked through. But surely to goodness you could start that with this Parliament now and work your way through to something that hopefully at the next election when Labor's elected, we'd be able to pick it up. But I'm not here to point score about it. It is hard and it's challenging. But we could do this. The Prime Minister went out to Dubbo the other day, saw 2 dead sheep on the road and heard the plight of the farmers and set up a fund the next day in the Parliament. You know, you can do these things if there's a will. But for natives, hang on, we've got to slow down. Now, this is... I listened closely to what the Governor-General said in these very few words, and says there's some big things coming towards us, and of course there are. But we've also can't be afraid of them, and we've got to prepare to capitalise on them in order to take our nation further than where it's been. And we'll only move further if we have the courage to face up to the 3 things that have been asked for out of Uluru. Voice of the Parliament, entrench that voice to give security to the First Nations and get down the road of a treaty making. On its own, a voice to the Parliament may do some wonderful things about how Parliament, its policies and its laws impact First Nations, if we ever get to that. Entrenching it in the Constitution may give it some security. But these substantive issues of sovereignty, dispossession, compensation, sovereign funds and a relationship to the government are still there, just some of the matters that need to be put on the table around a treaty-making process. So the substantive matters that cause the discord and division on an ongoing basis are broader and beyond the provision of services and the quality of services and the factors of life, reducing incarceration rates, stopping domestic violence. You know, all of those things are very critical and very important, and they have to be got on with. As we also deal with these matters because they're critical to the future structure and nature of our civil society. And we have this opportunity as a nation to do it. There's goodwill, I know, on Julian's side. The Minister, I know, pulls his hair out every night on this matter, but he doesn't have a lot of time to get it lined up. And the First Nations people obviously want to get moving. So what is stopping it? What is stopping it? And I'll leave you to your own analysis on that. I have a particular view, but surely to goodness, if you can see miracles, you must be able to see the need for one here. You know, what is there to be afraid of from the First Nations people? We've been welcomed here to this beautiful, wonderful land, and it's been going on for a long time. Every place we go to, the traditional owners welcome us in open arms. We heard about the Yiramalay School, the wonderful work going on in the Kimberley there, with kids from the Kimberley and all over, going down to Victoria and learning wonderful things in that part of the world as well. Australians are capable of this. Now, if you're part of the silent majority, you better tell the bloke who's listening to you that something's got to be done, because he's not listening to my side of politics. And what a different world this would be. What a different world this would be, where we were all able to come together, celebrate and participate in the greatness of what this nation's capable of doing, and how much of an example we would show to the rest of the world. But unity of human beings, of diversity, of difference, of culture and of belief can sit in the one nation and celebrate. Thank you.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, eh? So, my name's Thomas Mayer. I'm not as well known as Pat and Julian, but I'm a Wharfie. I'm from not far from here, Darwin, and a Torres Strait Islander, and I pay my respects to the Gumatj people. This is your land and always will be. I just want to briefly, I think, because a lot has been covered already, just from the experience of someone that was at Uluru, that was not long ago an activist on the streets in Darwin, express why I think that this is so important. The Uluru Statement from the Heart and the constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice. From my perspective, I felt, organising on the streets in Darwin, that there was something missing. You know, we're very disconnected as far as our advocacy goes. We could have half a dozen speakers at a rally and 20 different solutions to a problem. And so I started to realise that we needed more, you know, we needed to be organised better. And so when the constitutional dialogue came to Darwin, I was really excited. I was excited because I learnt that there was to be these dialogues all around the country, and that it was an opportunity for First Nations people from so many places, from so many backgrounds, to really come together and try and reach a consensus about what we wanted to achieve in big picture reform. And so when I went to Uluru, there was a moment when it was endorsed that was unforgettable. And it's something that the constitutional experts call a constitutional moment. And I think it's something that we should celebrate for millennia to come, and it should drive us to achieve voice treaty truth. And when Professor Megan Davis read the last words of the statement, in 1967 we were counted, in 2017 we seek to be heard, we leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country, we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. The entire room stood as one and endorsed it with standing acclamation. Now don't forget that when our people come together, we're not homogenous, we have many different views, we have different political perspectives, we have different levels of healing. But when we stood as one and endorsed the Uluru Statement from the Heart, that should be a constitutional moment, a moment where the Constitution can change and should change. So after Uluru, came here to Garma, and we were excited that we were on the cusp of change. But as was hoped, the leadership couldn't take us there. But leadership changes. And I acknowledge that we have a great opportunity, that bipartisanship support is there again. And that the Honourable Linda Burney will work with the Honourable Ken Wyatt. And hopefully, you know, Indigenous people can lead another process of co-design that puts that detail that is needed for the people to vote yes at a referendum, and then the leadership of this country, with the courage required, will take it to the people and will vote yes. And I just want to share you one more thing. I know that the Australian people will support this. For the last 2 years, myself, with many others, have taken the Uluru Statement to the people, explained the importance of constitutional enshrinement, explained how it can change those awful statistics that we should be ashamed of as a country, the most incarcerated people on the planet, the suicide rates. When you explain these things to people, that it is a unifying vision, they do support it. And I don't only talk to people from my side of the politics, I've talked to people in the Barangaroo Towers, you know, at universities, from the Business Council. People will support this if you explain it. And so the most vital thing going forward is leadership. The leadership of all of the leaders that are here, whether you're a politician, whether you're a CEO of a service provider, whether you're a leader of your community, whether you work at a university, whether you're a union official, we must take the lead, because what the politicians will need for us to achieve a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution is for us to be behind them in such a strong way that they're confident that we can win it. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. I'm going to be brief because I'm by far the least important person on this panel. I've been asked to offer a few comments that could contribute to our conversations on this very important topic from my area of work, which is in comparative law of Indigenous rights. Now, I grew up in New Zealand on the lands of Kāti Māmoe, Aotearoa, and I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of Melbourne, and I am a professor at Melbourne Law School. I want to acknowledge the law of the Gumatj people, and I want to thank them for their incredible hospitality. So I just want to make a couple of points about the comparative context. Now, there are a number of deficits in Australian constitutional and public law that make it harder for Indigenous peoples here to achieve their goals and fulfil their aspirations. Some of them are obvious. For example, we have no treaties, well, not yet at least. We have no Bill of Rights or even a Bill of Rights Act at the federal level. We have no reserved seats for Indigenous representation in our parliaments. But I think there's another angle that is less well understood, I think, outside of people who work with constitutional law, and that is that courts in our peer countries, especially in Canada and New Zealand, have developed a doctrine that requires government to consult with Indigenous peoples when making decisions that impact directly on their interests. Courts in Australia have not done this. As it stands, Australian governments can make laws that uniquely affect and burden Indigenous peoples, and they can do that without even bothering to ask them what their views on those laws are, let alone asking for their consent. In light of these deficits in Australian law relative to our peers of Canada and New Zealand, I think it should be clear to everyone that the proposals in the Uluru Statement from the Heart are modest, achievable, and I would say vitally necessary. I wanted to make a second point. Some of our politicians and some indeed members of the community are very committed to an idea of Australian democracy that makes no distinction between Indigenous and settler Australians, between the extreme Indigenous minority at 3% and the settler majority at 97%. I think this does not represent equality or justice in a multi-people, multinational state. Something much more is needed, and the Uluru Statement proposals go a long way to mitigating that vast injustice in our democracy. And I'd like to finish by recalling that last year at Garma, Jawa Yunupingu made the following statement, and I've written it down because I want to make sure to get it right. He said, "We're not united in this country. We're not comfortable. We remain uncertain and troubled by this truth because we live side by side as two people, two laws in one country. And because it is one country, that's why it must be in the Constitution. And I'd add that it can also be in treaties." Thanks very much.